So, what happens when a German rabbi in Germany encounters a German man who has in the past held, let's say, extremist beliefs against Jews? Or maybe the better question is, what can happen? Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi, and thank you for joining me for a weekly word of Torah. The story I'd like to tell you today is something I heard this past week. One of my dearest friends and one of the very few people on the face of this planet that I call rabbi spent a few days with my wife and with me and told me about an encounter he had last Passover. He was outside burning chametz with his children in apparently a very large and dramatic fire basin, and someone who lived nearby and their grandmother saw what was happening, saw that there was food involved here, and were a little distraught. What's going on? What's happening? Well, my dear friend knew a little bit about the history of the gentleman. And of course, you can imagine the calculations that go on in the brain at that time. I know that in my case, there would have been calculations of fear. My friend is significantly more bold than I am in the world. And he just started answering the question. We're burning chametz. But it was more than that. Through his encounters with this person before, he knew that they were on a type of spiritual journey. Maybe it's not the spiritual journey that I would want to call that, or you would want to call that, but my friend recognized that this person was on their own unique path. And that being the case, there's something in linguistics we call code shifting. Code shifting is when you're out with your mates, you speak slightly differently than when you are speaking with your rabbi. I guess that depends on who your rabbi is, with your parents. And so he code shifted, not just into rabbi mode, because I think he's always in rabbi mode because that's simply who he is, but he shifted into the discussion of the chametz based on what someone who is in a spiritual journey would need to hear. If someone who's never seen the burning of chametz for Passover before, there's a lot of ways to answer it. One can answer it very much like the 4 questions in the Passover Seder itself. For example, one can answer to the wise child and say, these are the rules and regulations. And quite frankly, because of the history of this person, you could also have chosen to answer to the evil child. How dare you even ask me that? With your background, you have no right to even be in dialogue with me. How dare you? But no, in some respectful combination of the simple child and the one who doesn't know to ask, my friend explained that this was about finding all the junk inside of ourselves, our bodies, our souls, and then symbolically getting rid of it once a year, allowing that opportunity to clean it all out and make room for more. Now you have to watch to the end of the video to find out what happened. But it's all related because we are entering into Parashat Devarim, so the first parasha of the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy. And I want to look at Deuteronomy a little bit meta today. Not just what's in the book of Devarim, but a little bit of academic acknowledgement for some of the complications. Now, if our relationship with Torah is the yearly cycle of Torah, this weekly read collection of poetry and narrative and stories and laws that gives us anchor within Judaism, then unless we're studying Judaism at the university, there's not much in it for us to, well, really look at this at an academic level. If you really want to spend some time thinking about the religious implications, the everyday religious implications, that's the book behind me. Just finally got my book published, and that's really what it's about. And I make the argument that, yes, our books of the Torah came from multiple sources over multiple times with multiple editing processes. And rather than being something that we use that to throw it all away and say, well, see, it's not an exploration of literal divine voice and a literal Sinai. Nothing in our tradition has to be literal. I'll make the argument that the fact that multiple voices from multiple times were combined together is a feature, not a bug. We are the people who can put arguing disparate voices together and come out with a cohesive whole. But the cohesiveness of that whole is a whole that continues the dialogue and the disagreement. Why do you think we're still here? And so, yeah, the book of Deuteronomy is a retelling. That's what Deuteronomy means, Deuteronomium. It is a second telling, a second explaining of the narrative. From a narrative standpoint, what's happening is we're about to cross over into the promised land. We're on the other side of the Jordan, and Moshe Rabbeinu is standing there on a soapbox for 3 months, and he recounts everything from the Exodus up until that moment. And he recounts it differently than it actually happened in the first recounting of the narrative. And from an academic standpoint, that's one of the ways that we know that they're different texts. But this is the religion of Judaism. There's also a theological and even a, if you want some good word skills today, teleological exploration. Theological is what do we learn about the nature of the eternal as the eternal deals with us through different books of Torah. The teleological, what's the purpose of these books? And the purpose of Deuteronomy is different than the others, but in the narrative, it's also different than the others. See, here's the trick. The people that Moses is speaking to, other than Caleb and Joshua and himself, are a new generation. They are not the people who were in slavery. And so doesn't it make sense that they would need to have their tradition, their history, their spirituality explained in a slightly different way? Wouldn't you need to meet them in a different place of dialogue in order for the words to have any resonance with this new generation that without Moses is going to move off and become eventually what we know as Judaism today? And in Sefer Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, there are many examples of a story being told slightly different than the first time, but the most dramatic is the 10 Commandments, the 10 utterances. Because even though the utterances are the same, there are details that are different, and because it's Shabbos, let's just grab Shabbos for a second. In the book of Exodus, when we first encounter the 10 utterances, we hear that you have to zachor, that you have to remember the day of the Sabbath. Zachor yom ha-Shabbat v'kadshehu. You have to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Keep it holy means you elevate it, you move it as something different from the rest of the days. You unplug your electronic devices. He said, ironically, as you might be watching my sermon on Shabbat, how about we unplug ourselves from our dangerous arguments and angers? But then we get to Devarim. Then we get to the second series of these utterances, and we get that you have to shamor et yom Shabbat v'kadshehu. You have to observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. But it goes into an even deeper level because the reasons behind having a Sabbath are different between the two different versions of the 10 utterances. In the first version, in the one of the book of Exodus and Shemot, we understand that we have to observe Sabbath because it's a reflection of the creation of the universe. On the seventh day, the Eternal rested. But it's a completely different reason the second time we hear the 10 utterances. Now our job is to observe and protect because we were once slaves in Egypt. Well, let's look at the two audiences then in the narrative. Let's look at theologically who was being spoken to in these two different sets of utterances. In the first iteration, these were the people who just came out of slavery in Egypt. Doesn't it make sense that these people probably had it fully on their mind? See, when we're working in counseling with people who've gone through a trauma, you have people, at least within CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, visualize where they're going to be, not necessarily exist from where they were. We try to move someone out of seeing their entire life through the trauma to having trauma inform people with wisdom as people overcome and strengthen themselves. And so to take people who just came out of the trauma of slavery and the exodus and the fear and say, hey, remember this, doesn't seem to make much sense. But look at why you are coming out of this. Look at why you are developing a new type of society. Look at why you are experimenting with new thoughts of ethics and morality, because you are part and dialogue to this eternal creation. You are part of something bigger than yourselves. Then we get to the second iteration, where now it's a group of people who did not come out of slavery in Egypt, and they're told to remember that. Why? Because the second you forget about the bad things that have happened to us and our ancestors in the past, the moment that we find ourselves in some analogous slavery ourselves, we recreate a situation that our ancestors fought to overcome. Better put, nothing ever happened before the day that I was born, and I have nothing to learn from anyone older than I. And so doesn't it make complete sense that the reason for the Sabbath day is it's a part of who you are. It's a part of your identity across multiple generations. And then even the zachor v'shemor, the remember and then the observe. Well, it's completely logical. In the very first iteration of the 10 utterances, you've got the evolution and the development of this dialogue between the Eternal and Moshe Rabbeinu, between Moshe Rabbeinu and the people, to figure out what Shabbos observance is. After 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, there is a set Shabbos observance. And so now it's not about remembering as you're developing. Now it is observe, because we've got the rules in front of us. We now know what we need to do. What's happened here? The first generation and the next generation were obviously different generations. And I say obviously, except for the fact, how many times have we talked with everyone with whom we speak using identically the same words and ideas? This is my truth. The problem is we're not the center of the universe. We mimic the existence of the eternal in the universe when we enter into a moment of dialogue. And a moment of a dialogue is not, I am the only voice that matters. It is this person across from me, whether I love them or whether they are the biggest challenge in the world to me, are part of the holy moment of dialogue in this moment, which means I actually have to modify what I say so that I can be heard. This is the sacred obligation of creation as we bring it into our everyday life. So what happens when we do that? What happens when we accept this as a truth of the nature of the eternal? Instead of throwing away the Torah because it's multiple voices over time, we understand that that is the divine inspiration. The fact that multiple voices over time were in this dialogue with that which was greater than them, we come across the greater wisdom which tells us that these words are not always appropriate in every situation, because we need to look into the eyes and soul of the person with whom we are interacting and understand there's as much God in them as in us. They have as much right to be a human as us, regardless of how filled with hatred their life may be. They are still no less a child of the eternal than we are. That is the entire essence behind the idea of love your neighbor as yourself, and the stranger in your midst you shall love as yourself, because you were once strangers in Egypt, which leads us to our ethical center. That which is reprehensible to you, do not do to someone else. When someone's speaking to us, do we want to be part of a dialogue, or are we going to accept being on the receiving end of a monologue? It's not fun, is it? Then why don't we consider with whom we are speaking and their humanity? We will have to change our words if we want to be in dialogue. If we don't want to be heard, we can say it the same way we always have before. So, back to my friend and his story. A few weeks later, this person shows up at his doorstep and said, can you bring out the container that the chametz was burnt in again? Because I have some chametz that I need to burn. What's a rabbi to do? Well, if you're as good of a rabbi as my friend is, you go and you look in this person's eyes and see what's happening. And you pull out the container and you light it. And this person opened up a pack with t-shirts and records and books and said, these are things I no longer want as part of my life. And he began burning. I saw pictures of it, and I can tell you that it is as bad as you think it is. And yet, had my friend not been a rabbi par excellence, meaning taking this person who came to him to ask, what's happening here, to then answer in a way that could be heard, instead of rebuking someone who, quite frankly, by everything that we know in the world, should be rebuked, he gave an opportunity for something else to happen. The thing that we don't think is even possible happened through the simple ethical actions of, and the stranger in your midst you shall love as yourself, because you were once strangers in Egypt. The person burned his chametz in a way that we should take more seriously. There's more stuff that we need to get out of our lives, and part of it is our inability to talk with people with whom we disagree today. Let's do a little bit better, and let's honor the possibility when we are a little more sophisticated with our words. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We'll see you next time.